Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to discuss with you further on our topic regarding US civil rights. If you haven't already, I strongly recommend you check out our previous videos in this series, where we've analysed the change over time that has happened for the African American people as we've gone right up from the 19th century to the early 20th century, and now here we are at the Second World War. As always, do remember this is a lesson catered towards the student level, where we practice some key historical techniques and some key knowledge learned along the way. With that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So in today's video, we're going to build ourselves the contextual background around this conflict, how America got involved, what the war was like for them, and then we'll get into the impact of the war on the African Americans as a whole. With that said, let's get straight into it. So we should remember from previous videos in the series that America has had a pretty rough time in the 1930s. We've had a massive change of presidency, going from Hoover to Roosevelt, and we have ourselves a big change in ideology. They've gone from laissez-faire, staying out of affairs, and wanting to get big on interventionism, especially on the domestic politics. However, in doing so, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, Roosevelt actually neglected doing this on the world stage. In prioritizing domestic policy, Roosevelt was continuing to practice isolationism or non-interventionism, depending on which school of historian you discuss this matter with. However, in the 1930s, as economies were collapsing around the world, a lot of European nations began to turn towards right-wing dictatorships as a solution to their problems. For instance, we see the rise of sudden dictatorships in Italy with the rise of Benito Mussolini, the El Duce. We see the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany with the Nazi Party. And Japan also has a big shift to the right with its imperialism under its emperor Hirohito. Roosevelt was quite concerned with the world and the way it had fallen at this time, and he actually desired to improve relations with Great Britain, a nation he believed was going to try and follow the idealist principles that Woodrow Wilson had established. However, Congress did not really support this. Congress had been very against getting involved in European affairs after the First World War. Congress actually refused to join the League of Nations, this big international institution that was working to prevent World War conflicts from happening again. And America hadn't really got involved in international affairs too much, especially regarding Europe, since the early 1920s. We have to remember as well that the last time a Democratic president got involved in wider conflicts had lost 116,000 of his people, and so many people did not really want to see this happen again. Therefore, instead of getting involved in European affairs, Congress actually passed a series of neutrality bills that actually made it illegal for America to support a European nation in any other war, and also made it illegal for American citizens to leave America and travel to Europe to fight in such conflicts. While Roosevelt opposed these bills, he of course had no choice because his party was very much supportive of them, and therefore these bills became laws and officially called the Neutrality Act. Therefore, when the Second World War did break out in 1939, the United States remained officially neutral. Roosevelt even made this clear in many of his fireside chats that he was having on the radio, promising the American people he would not take them to war and remain detached from the entire affair. However, extremist factions like Italy and Germany actually had a lot of success in the early points of the war. By June 1940, France was defeated, and Germany was able to conduct a massive aerial bombardment campaign, informally called the Blitz, against the British. Roosevelt began to argue that the British did need the American support, believing that if Britain did fall and was defeated by the Germans, then America would have a dictatorial nation to have to deal with alone. Roosevelt's words resonated with the public, and he actually succeeded in winning by a landslide election of 1940. However, many congressmen still doubted that Germany even wanted to fight America during this war, but Roosevelt kept pushing through and managed to pass a Lend-Lease Act in March 1941. This scheme allowed America to send many war materials, tanks, guns, planes, and other equipment to the British on the promise that they would be paid back during and after the war. This plan actually was quite economically successful for the Americans and totaled $51 billion by the end of the war in 1945. However, America was still not directly involved. While they were financially aiding the British and other allies in the war, they were not actually fighting on the ground. However, this changed on an infamous day in December 7, 1941, when Japan became involved and launched a series of massive attacks in the Pacific Theater. It infamously bombed Pearl Harbor, a naval base of the Americans in Hawaii. It was quite devastating and many thousands of Americans were killed. Roosevelt went to Congress and declared that their economic intervention was not enough. They ceded oil trade with the Japanese, but it was clear that this was not enough. They would have to retaliate with outright war as the only true solution. Isolationism has simply not delivered peace, and this idea became largely discredited in US politics. Ironically, it was this war that actually was the thing that got America out of its economic depression. Because they were now mass producing weapons and resources, they actually were now needing loads of people to come into employment, which reduced it all the way to near zero. And industry profits actually saw America gain some $47 billion independent of the Lend-Lease scheme during the conflict. By the war's end in August 1945, America was officially the richest country in the world. However, by getting involved in this war, where 16 American people were fighting in the conflict, over a million of them would die and many more would be wounded. Roosevelt himself, despite winning another term in office for the fourth time, a record, in 1944, he would not live to see the end of the conflict. He would die in April 1945, some months after meeting the leaders of Britain and Russia, Britain being the gentleman there, Winston Churchill on the right, and Russia represented by Stalin on the left. With Roosevelt's passing, he would be succeeded by another Democrat president called Harry S. Truman, and he's going to play a big role with civil rights as we go forward into the series after the Second World War. However, we've talked a lot here about the context of the war and how America's got involved and their reasons for doing so. However, what is the impact on this on the African American community? We're going to turn now to a couple of sources to try and illustrate this idea. So these two images came out during the conflict between 1941 and 1945. I think it's very telling how different they both portray the South. I think we'll look at the first one on the right. We see here there's a clear sense of national identity and national pride. And there's a clear message under the American flag, which is United We Win. And I think it's very important to know that there is a white worker and a black worker both operating on an aeroplane here, the front shell of it. And so it's very important we see this image, it's very clear, it's very patriotic. The message is simple. African Americans and whites have to put their differences aside and work together as one nation to be successful and win this war against the greater threat in Europe. However, the image on the left tells a very different story to of course, the propaganda the American industry was trying to pump out at the time. Now, a whole reason America's got involved in this war is this idea of liberation. We can see that patch on one of the American soldiers running away from the United States out towards the left. And a big thing Roosevelt was talking about was they had to intervene to stop the likes of the Germans, Italians, and the Japanese from oppressing different people. Although we don't touch upon it in this video series, a very horrific thing the Germans were doing especially was capturing Jewish people and putting them in concentration camps and murdering them en masse. And likewise, the Japanese were doing similar to the Chinese. There's a very famous massacre at Nanking, one of the cities in China, where they killed millions of people. There's some really horrific things the Axis powers of the Japanese and Germans especially that they do during the conflict. And so America, when it was finding these things out, was really believing this idea that they were liberating these other nations, they were freeing these enslaved people from their oppression. However, one thing we can't overlook here, on reflection, America seems hypocritical, and a lot of African Americans will point this out. Remember what we said, the African Americans are not equal in their society, they're considered racially inferior, they're segregated, there's very famous and infamous cases in the South of African Americans being beaten, lynched to death, and racially abused. And so it's quite paradoxical of America to go to Europe on this promise of freedom, but then to not do likewise for its own people at home. And also, likewise, to then hypocritically ask African Americans to support them in this conflict, even though the freedoms that the Americans were fighting for abroad were not being given to Africans at home. And so we're going to see during the war what happens on the home front as the American government and the American nation at large has to battle with this complex situation of their hypocrisy and how the African Americans will use the war as proof, as a driving point, as maybe a turning point for why they should be liberated and given those freedoms that they're so-called fighting abroad to give to other nations that are not their own. What will this look like? What will the situation be for African Americans during the Second World War? Will they make any progress? That's what we're going to find out in the following lesson in this series. And we go into the home front during the Second World War and the impact of it for the African American community. I hope you found this video, as always, quite insightful. There's been some good background knowledge to give us some information. And again, if they want to do any wider reading about this, there will be some reading in the description box below about the Second World War that you can check out. If you would want any deeper detail about the Second World War conflict, just let me know and I can work on a series for that, how the campaigns went, what the experience of the Americans was like, and maybe about some more of the atrocities that sadly were occurring for the many in Europe at the time. But with all that said, I'll see you in my class for the following video when we go into the impact for the African American community and on civil rights at home in America. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our future lessons and also keep track of lessons that have happened before. With all that said, thank you for watching. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.